Welcome to Beyond the Surface. We highlight unique voices in architecture and design. We share their stories to uncover who they are beyond the surface. Hi, I'm your host, Alex Sanchez, representing our Beyond the Surface team. Today's episode is called Design as Exchange with our guest, Monica Chadha. Monica is founder and principal of Civic Projects Architecture, a Chicago-based social impact design firm with a focus on high-quality design and long-term strategic thinking. Prior to starting her firm, she served as founding director of Impact Detroit and led project teams at both Studio Gang and Ross Barney Architects. Monica has led the design teams for cultural institutions such as the Sunshine Community Center and Yollocalli Arts Reach, National Museum of Mexican Art. Monica is currently working with the RAA on the Obama Presidential Center Museum. Monica serves on the Board of Trustees of the Grant Foundation and has been an adjunct professor at the Illinois Institute of Technology, engaging students in social impact design. She holds a Master's of Architecture from the University of Illinois at Chicago and a Bachelor's of Environmental Studies in Architecture from the University of Waterloo, Canada. I'm very happy to have you here today. Very excited to have this conversation. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm really happy to be here. I've been excited about this conversation for a while, so it'll be fun.
I'm very excited to learn more about you, so let's get this episode started. So can we first talk a little bit about your background and how you grew up?
So I am first generation Canadian. Both my parents are Indian. I think that's kind of important when we talk a little bit about the work we do. And one of the things, I think we'll talk a little more about this, is when I was in undergrad, I felt there was a gap between the education I was getting and kind of my cultural background. So I actually went back to India and worked in the Vastu Shilpa Foundation, which is part of Balkrishna Doshi's architecture practice. And Balkrishna Doshi, for those who may not know, was a Pritzker Prize-winning architect in Ahmedabad in India.
I feel like being first generation Canadian and practicing in Chicago is a pretty interesting path. Can you talk a little bit more about what it felt to be a first generation Canadian?
So it's kind of interesting. Like, I'll be honest, when I was younger, I don't think I thought about it as much because so many people around me were from so many different cultures and so many different countries. Like, I grew up in Ottawa, which is the capital, so it was a relatively diverse city to grow up in. But, I was like one of 3 Indians in my high school, right? So you kind of always had that dichotomy between kind of what you did at home a little bit and kind of what you did at school. I was also put into French immersion from kindergarten, so I speak French fluently and I speak Hindi like a tourist. So it kind of becomes this interesting or confusing moment, right? Like someone will look at me and it's like, oh, you don't know everything about your background and culture, but you know all this stuff about kind of being Canadian and growing up in Canada. I mean, I joke about this and you guys might laugh, but like, my name's Monica, my sister's name's Susan, right? We don't have Indian first names. We came at a point when it was about assimilation. So a lot of what we did at home, I didn't realize was kind of religious and cultural, but I didn't know it. Like we had traditions around holidays. Diwali we celebrated at home, but a lot of it I thought was about being Indian more than I thought it was about being Hindu. So I think that kind of weaved into my interest about kind of not so much architecture, but space. And I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit more, but my interest about space and place, I would imagine, probably started back then.
And I find that interesting because when I was researching you, for example, I was reading some of your past interviews. And I remember in one of the interviews, one thing that stuck out to me was you were talking about how it felt to be part of the Western culture, knowing that culturally you're not from a Western culture, right? So can you talk about how you felt culture is in spaces, especially leading up to your education?
I think that's a really good question. I like the way you're asking these questions because it's a little bit different than maybe how I've thought about it before. And I was really lucky in that I was able to travel to India as I was growing up. I actually, in high school, in like 9th grade, I actually spent a whole summer in India. So my upbringing kind of blended, like my grandparents would come, I would go to India. So I think by the time I got to college, I was aware there was more than Western European education, right? I was aware that not every single thing started in Europe. And I think probably like through the course of my education, I started craving that. I don't think I had the language or the tools to understand what that meant yet, but I was in a work study program. So I was in a co-op program. So every 4 months I would go to work, every 4 months I would go to school. And I did this for 3.5 years. So what happened is I talked to my co-op advisors and I was like, well, can I apply to work in India? And they're like, well, we don't know much about it, but if you can go and figure it out, sort of thing. So what I did was I just did my research. I applied to all these amazing firms in India. This is way back when. I got a faxed letter from Balkrishna Doshi's office from the Vastu Shilpa Foundation, and it was like, we will see you on January 5th or whatever date they established as my start date. Balkrishna Doshi is a Pritzker Prize winning architect in India, and fundamentally, when you look at his retrospective, when you look at his work, it's about architecture for the people. At the end of the day, when I look back now, I think that was like kind of almost like the beginning of what would eventually become Civic Projects.
And can you talk a little bit more about the foundation and the things that you learned there and was able to explore while being at the foundation?
So a lot of or several of the projects that Doshi's office did included what I would call flexible housing. So they literally housed, it was like the economically weak sector to sort of middle income. And in Arenya and other cities, they designed these houses that like weren't 100% complete. So if you needed some income, you could build the front room out and rent it to someone who worked nearby. Or you could build it out to be a store, or you could build it out for an elderly family member. So they were these like what I would call self-build housing, like the infrastructure was there and then you could self-build it. So I was really privileged. I actually got to work on a related project in another community that was built on this idea of self-made housing and the idea that people can impact. It wasn't about the architecture and what the building looked like, it was about how you use it. And how you use it became how the building got designed. So that was at the core of so much of his work, both his civic work and his residential work.
I feel like those ideas really come out, especially in your present work, in civic projects. But before we get into that, of course, can you talk about how you chose to move to Chicago and your transition between Canada and Chicago?
So it was really interesting. So originally, I was able to do this work study for 4 months in Chicago as part of the co-op program that I mentioned earlier. So it was a great opportunity. I mean, I worked in Vancouver, I worked in Toronto, I worked in India, I worked in Chicago. This program sort of showed me the world in a different way. So literally end of the semester, I didn't have a job. Jerome Eastman in Chicago was posting, and I was like, let's see what happens. And I think I scared all of my family when I took the job in Chicago. Growing up in Canada, we did not know much about this wonderful city. And I came for 4 months. And it was summer, it was Chicago, it was incredible. And then a year later when I graduated, the economy wasn't great. There wasn't a lot of work in Toronto. So I took a 1-year position here. This is when we had free trade visas. You could come and work a little more easily in the States. And I took this 1-year position with this notion of I'm going to go down to the States for a year, go back to Canada. I mean, Canadians are fiercely proud, and I'm very proud of my background, so I didn't imagine that I would stay here. So that was a very long time ago. I came for 4 months and have stayed pretty much ever since.
Can we talk about what grad school was like? I know that you were a mother while in grad school. Can you talk about that experience?
So once I was in Chicago for about a year, I learned about this program called ArchiWorks, which was co-founded by Stanley Tigerman and Eva Maddox. So ArchiWorks is actually a 9-month post-professional diploma certificate where you spend the 9 months working in community on social impact work. So this was when social impact design, participatory architecture were less common words in the vocabulary of architecture. So for me, it was a real privilege to go and work in community. So we actually worked in West Humboldt Park. We actually built a park over the summer. But the idea of it is that I learned that there were more than one way to do architecture. And that was something that I think kind of built on working in Doshi's office in India and then getting to do this program. A mentor of mine, Tom Foreman, also taught me about social housing models across the country and the world. It just all these things were kind of starting to stitch together. And I knew I was going to go do my master's degree at some point. I hadn't really figured out when because I was able to work full-time in architecture. It ended up being about 10 years after undergrad that I went back for grad school. And the adventures behind that was, by the time I chose to go back to grad school, I was married. My husband had just done grad school. I was about to do grad school. We had this all figured out, right? Like, you do grad school, I do grad school, then we go figure out everything else. And after I'd accepted grad school, I found out I was pregnant. And I was going to go to school anyway, right? I'm like, I'll take 4 months off. I can do this. And then I found out I was pregnant with twins, at which point my doctor's like, you might want to like defer your acceptance for a year. You know, you might want to think about it. So when I finally got to starting grad school, I chose to stay in Chicago instead of going somewhere else because we had a really great family network. We had really good family support here. So my twins were 10 months old when I started grad school.
I feel like that probably was exciting but scary.
Terrifying. I didn't know any better.
Yeah. While you were mother in grad school, how did you start thinking about design? Did it change the way you thought about design?
That's a good question. Yes, but in all these kind of quirky ways. So I was at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and for those who know the building, it is not the most accessible or easy building to get around. Before I went back for school, I had a double stroller, and I was going to do reviews for a friend of mine. And I think it took me 20 minutes to get to the room that I needed to be in, because in theory, it was accessible, right? But you had to go like this way and then that way and then that way. So like to take 20 minutes to get to the review because I was navigating it with a double stroller. And similarly, it's like realistically, I don't know at the end of the day how much I've been able to like impact change because I had kids and was trying to navigate the physical environment, but you kept observing and seeing what was wrong. So when I was in grad school, particularly when I did this studio visit, I had to pump. I had twins, you know, breastfeeding was part of raising the girls, and I had to get an extension cord in a toilet stall to be able to pump because there was just nowhere to go. So what it probably impacted, now that you're kind of asking about it, is kind of thinking about spaces from different perspectives. Because up until then, I didn't have that perspective. And I went to Rome. I actually was able to do the study abroad semester when I was in grad school. And again, like, the school is an absolutely wonderful school, but it didn't really have accommodations for like, oh, you're a family with kids doing a study abroad program. So like I found some of my own housing. I got support, right? Everybody was really, really helpful, but there just wasn't accommodations, right? Like a mom with twins in grad school was just not something you did in architecture.
Yeah. And I remember earlier you also mentioned useful design and thinking about the uses and how they can be used. So could you also talk about what it means to define alternative practice in architecture?
So my dream is that we don't talk about it as alternative practice. That's my dream. I'm sure other people you've had on and colleagues of mine have probably said the same thing. But alternative practice, I think right now is about kind of accepting that like everyone is not the same. Everyone is not going to do something in the same way, right? Like I may want to talk to you in this conversation. Someone may want to communicate via email. Somebody may want a quiet space to sort of think in. Someone else may want to have a conversation. So we just have to recognize that how we approach architecture needs to be more inclusive and accommodate different people's needs. Because sometimes it may be that the physical space that is constructed isn't radically different than what could have been there, but you feel like you have a sense of belonging, right? You feel that it was designed for you. And we use a lot of unconventional or maybe non-traditional architectural ways to get to those conversations to then make spaces.
I really like that you said that because, well, I'm interested in experiential design.
Yeah.
I'm always interested in how people experience spaces, and I feel like that's also, like, it's pretty similar to what you were saying because you think about the different perspectives people have on spaces and how they are impacted by the spaces, whether negatively or positively, and how it could be more efficient. So I did like that you said that. So with understanding what you wanted to do in architecture, how did that eventually lead you to Civic Projects?
Well, it was a really long road. So like now it's easy to say, oh, when I worked in Balkrishna Doshi's office in India, it had an impact on what I do now, right? In hindsight, it's super easy. But what I did learn coming out of undergrad was sort of craving knowing more, right? Craving understanding more about how people work and definitely civic institutions, cultural institutions more broadly. So soon after grad school, I worked with Carol Ross Barney at Ross Barney Architects. And with Carol, I learned so much about the public realm. I mean, Carol is a mentor, continues to be a mentor. and her passion and commitment to public spaces. Again, architecture for the people, the idea that good design is for everyone. It's not about income or budget or socioeconomic status. It's about making quality and well-designed spaces for everybody to experience. So absolutely formative to the work that I do. And then the privilege at one point of being able to transition and working studio gang. So again, you can imagine if you think about Jeannie's work, some of the work we were doing at that time was a blend between competitions, some work in the south side of Chicago, and we were also pursuing some work in India. So all of a sudden, I had this moment where some of what I had learned and knew was blending right into professional practice, right? Like more directly than maybe it had before. But then I hit a point and I started realizing I was doing a lot of work around, there was Association for Community Design. There were these conferences called Structures for Inclusion. So there was a lot of social civic conversation happening. I don't know exactly what the button was, but this is when I ended up going to I didn't move to Detroit, but I did work in Detroit where it was architecture wasn't spending enough time in a place or in a community. So when people ask, people were like, why are you leaving working at, Studio Gang to do something else? Because I didn't even know I was going to have a practice at that point. I was like, I need more time in community. You need to start by listening. And that's where I think you've maybe heard me say this before, but you need 3 to 5 years in a neighborhood or in a community or with an organization to actually truly kind of be able to listen and impact change. So the work in Detroit became the beginning of what would eventually become Civic Projects.
Well, first, I do want to say, I really do like the work that you guys do. And I always thought, it was important to listen to who you're serving. But I do know of, some of the work that you have done with Studio Gang and Carol's Barney. And it always stood out to me because I feel like when you're coming out of school, you're always thinking about the big firms, the dream firms, the ones that you want to work at. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But I guess what I'm saying is, there comes a certain point when you start thinking about what the value of design is. And I feel like that was something that you started to notice, what design actually meant for a community and how it can impact communities. I do think that also depends on what type of work you end up wanting to do. If you want to do high rises, that's a totally different network. But I think the way you grew up, BV Doshi, and everything kind of led up to this point where you started to question what you wanted to do with design. So can you talk a little bit more about the work you did in Detroit and how that eventually led to Civic Projects?
So one of the privileges I had is because I worked for 2 incredibly talented, fierce women who believed in public realm. So the opportunities to work with both Carol and Jeannie built also on what you're talking to that led to Detroit. So it was really nice to have this moment. I remember having this conversation with Jeannie where she's like, I think you want to do more than just what you're doing here in that moment in the office. And that was part of what helped me have the conviction to actually leave and go do this crazy part-time thing in Detroit and understand that when I had the opportunity to work in Detroit, Detroit was coming out of the bankruptcy. Detroit Future City as a plan for the city was just forming, so there wasn't a city-wide plan for growth in that moment. So I'm working in Detroit when there's one coffee shop downtown. It's 15 minutes to get everywhere. And so Dan Patera from the University of Detroit Mercy, their design center was working on what became the Detroit Future City planning, and they were doing all of the public engagement. So they engaged with thousands of people over the course of 2 years, and the amount of input and feedback they were able to get from public, from community, from stakeholders was astounding. And he invited me to be part of forming a nonprofit that eventually was called Impact Detroit. But what it was about was when you work in a neighborhood, it's not just about the architecture or just about the landscape, right? You need lawyers, you need people who understand economic development, you need people who understand sustainability, you need social workers who understand people. So the idea of that organization, Impact Detroit, was to be a broader umbrella than simply design.
Mm-hmm. And the way you made me think about it is, it takes a community to design a community. Yeah. It takes all these different aspects because a building is so much more powerful than what people make it seem. I do think it stems back to a little bit how I grew up. I didn't go to too many community centers, but in high school when I eventually started going, I think that eventually led me onto this pathway to wanting to do things that affect the community and pursuing architecture. Since my family is in construction, I always saw how a home can bring people together and started to saying like a person is raised by a neighborhood, but in order to be raised well, you need a neighborhood that can raise you. And so again, going back to like the thought of a community, you need a community to design a community.
I think that actually is really well said. It's like, I don't understand anymore how someone can just come in and be like, I know the answer, right? Like, if you work in community and listen and try to put your expert hat on to just help understand or help translate, right? Like, I don't really see myself as like, oh, I'm gonna come build everything, yay, right? It's like we're facilitators. Like, our expert role is listening and then facilitating a conversation that leads to space. I mean, we talk about this all the time, and I'm sure many people do, but it's like, we're not the experts at the table, right? And we talk about it, it's like there's inviting people to the table, and then there's even building the table together. So there's all these steps of like, you don't want to set a table and be like, oh, I decided what you're eating, I decided the whole recipes, and then it's like, come on in, and the person's like, well, I don't eat pork. Like, that's not fair, right? If I'd had a conversation with the person ahead and been like, what are the things you eat? What are your allergies? Can we work together? Can we make a meal together, right? Can we take all the ingredients and have a conversation? Architecture shouldn't be predefined.
Without the design ideas we just talked about, what became your mission for Civic Projects?
From leaving Studio Gang and sort of formally starting Civic Projects was about 3 years. And in that time, I was continuing to teach at IIT, and I was consulting and forming practice. So Carol allowed me to do some freelance work with her. I was traveling back and forth to Detroit. I was teaching. So all of those ideas were kind of percolating. Like, literally, some of why I think Civic Projects didn't start earlier was because like I didn't have a name that made sense. Even that took years. But the way I started it when I first talked about it was saying you need 3 to 5 years in a neighborhood. We talked a little bit about this. You need to be able to listen and then use that to create space. And that has evolved. And I know we'll talk about some of the projects, but that's evolved for me, sort of saying Civic Projects is about people, process, and place. People means everybody, right? People is our stakeholders, our clients, working collectively, might be other professionals, might be passersby, always clients. Like, we're all the team. And then that team goes through the listening process, goes through working together to define the project. You know, and sometimes the project might not even be architecture, right? Like, the solution has to be a solution that addresses the needs. We say we address place-based needs, but sometimes when you're doing strategic planning or working in early conversations, you realize that like a building is not the answer or the architecture is not the answer. So we may be fostering or working with an organization to, you know, go get funding to do some programming and sort of step back and not wear an architecture hat.
I know you guys do both consulting and architecture, and I feel like what this consulting side is making sure the project gets done, and I feel like that's probably the place where you get to listen to people. Am I right?
We definitely do, and it's kind of an interesting time for you to ask this question because we're looking at growth. We're 11 years old, and it's like, what next? So our engagement process, how you're defining consulting practice, it's the engagement, it's working with people, it's helping with grant writing. But a lot of it is, I also call pre-design. It's like the work you need to do before you get to the architecture. So a lot of that work then leads literally to architecture, or that work may be the project in itself. So I consider that we do engagement and design as a blend. And depending on the project, sometimes the front end is heavier, and sometimes building the physical space is heavier. So we've worked with the Chicago Torture Justice Center. The Chicago Torture Justice Center was founded out of the reparations from the Burge tortures in Chicago. So Chicago is one of the only cities in the country that has acknowledged that torture happened under their watch through the police department. One of the reparations was to establish a center to support survivors and tell the story. So there's no shiny building to point to for that project, but about 10 years ago, we started working with the then executive director just to understand what could be needed. So our very first conversation was dream big and talk to us about what you need. And one of our early engagements was one of the partners of one of the survivors stood up and said, oh, no one's ever asked us what we wanted when it came to space and place, right? The advocacy, the work, the legal work, absolutely crucial. But it was kind of the first time they had a conversation about place and space. So that's like an example on the one side.
I think one thing that is interesting about being able to like listen to people and really be able to execute it is the fact that they end up being able to have ownership of the building. I do want to know how you end up asking the right questions to people who don't always feel like their perspective is taken into consideration, especially when it comes to space.
Well, I think we don't really know what the questions are before we start. And I think that's really important, right? Like, we don't have a script. Nobody in our office has a script of like, ask these 5 questions and it equals a great building. I think a really good example of what you're asking about is Yollocalli Arts Reach for the National Museum of Mexican Art. Yollocalli was working with the city and was able to acquire a decommissioned fire station. So this was a lovely opportunity. A decommissioned fire station could become a space for youth and arts programming. And the executive director, Vanessa, understood that it couldn't be her voice, right? Like, Vanessa is a graduate of the Yollocalli program and is now executive director. And she understood the heart of the organization and the heart of the youth to be kind of the most critical. So what she did is she sought us out. Someone had mentioned us to her, had referred us, and sought us out to be like, we need to discover what this building could be. We need to discover what the program would be. And we started with just sort of kind of broad conversations. And we worked with alum, so former students of the program. We worked with current students of the program. We worked with their council, and we worked with the staff. And this project, I mean, it was such a privilege to work on this project because at every step of the way there was input. So in the beginning, there was this great moment where one of the young women in one of our discussions was trying to describe, like, we weren't like, do you need a classroom or do you need a ceramic studio? Those weren't our questions. And we were trying to understand and hear, like, what did the space want to feel like? To your point, right? Like, how do I feel ownership? And this young woman, it's like, well, I want a place where I can go to be weird and it's okay to be weird. And it's kind of like my best friend's bedroom, but not my best friend's bedroom, like one on TV. So that was part of our design brief, right? We had to design a space where you could feel like you could be yourself. And one of the really big things that happened around that time was we're like, okay, upstairs is for the youth and downstairs is for the public. And then now, like, many months later with the space created, you see it because each classroom is identified by the teachers, many of whom are graduates and active artists in Chicago. But I'm going to just back up a little bit is when we were going through that process, right, so we had these early discussions, and programmatically, we worked with Wallen Gomez Architects as the architect of record, and programmatically we were laying things out, we were understanding how spaces could be used, but we were constantly going back. Right? So we're like, how about this? And we would get feedback. And it's like, well, we want an office on the ground floor, but we don't want it to be like over enclosed, right? We want to take this large, where the fire trucks parked, and we want to make more intimate spaces, but we don't want to close it off, right? There's a DJ booth, recording booth. Its windows are facing what'll be a broader public area. So, you can have a DJ party or you can be recording for the radio station out of the same room. Like, it's visible, yet it's, acoustically quiet. All of these different things, but even when the renderings were being made, there was constant feedback. And I always joke about the disco balls because the disco balls are part of the identity, and there were disco balls in the rendering, and every time we'd go back, there wasn't enough color, there wasn't enough disco balls. So even the design of the rendering to have the vision of what the space could be was co-created. And then later, when we got into things like paints and finishes, that was co-created. We had a long discussion about pink because one pink was like, it was too Barbie pink and not bubblegum pink enough, right? So there's like 17 different paint colors in this building. And I can confidently say that building looks nothing like anything I could have imagined because It's not me who created that building.
I like the way you ended that, especially with it's not me who created that building, because I feel like that's the part that gives ownership to them. They were the ones who created the
Yeah.
building. You just help moderate it.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how architecture is advocacy, how design can be used for advocacy?
I think that architecture can be used for both advocacy and agency. Maybe it's kind of both of those things, because I really truly believe the Yollocalli space is giving agency to the youth to have a level of autonomy, to be creative in the space, to literally own the space, right? It's their space. We have the privilege of being invited as guests. But in terms of advocacy, it also shows it can be done, right? Like, I don't know, there's so many different like ways of defining advocacy that are going through my head right now. And I think that right now, I'll use the example of what's going on right now in Little Village, because the idea is that this is a safe space for youth and all are welcome and all the programming is free, but they've also been closed for the last 4 days because of the ice raids, right? Like their protection, the advocacy of the program is we're gonna close down so youth don't have to walk to us so that they can be safe. That's a different maybe kind of advocacy, but that's really resonating with me right now is like we've done all this work to create a space that is safe and accepting, and sometimes that's just not even enough.
And I feel like that's something that is going to affect architecture, especially in the future. And I feel like another thing that is going to start to shape architecture is the safety of everything, especially with everything that's going on with ICE, everything that's going on with cultures not being able to feel safe, not in just Chicago, but all over the US. I feel like it's going to be a new change for what that means for design.
I think you're right. And I also think we have to be optimistic. Using Yollocalli again as an example, right? There's glass garage doors at the front of the building, and that was a choice. We are scared right now, and people don't feel safe right now. But if we can't be optimistic in our architecture, right? If we can't sort of still make places that welcome people, okay, maybe for a little while, not everybody can be in the same space at the same time because of the politics, because of what's going on. But let's still create spaces that people can come together, right? You know, okay, it's wide enough that I can have my 6 feet if there's a pandemic, but it's welcoming enough I can use that same 6 feet to maybe have a conversation and a cup of coffee with someone. So I think we have to figure out how to be flexible, because if we're too rigid in how we build the architecture, then we're only building it for one moment in time.
I feel like what is scary is you never know how a building is going to be used in general, positive or negatively. But I think the important part is understanding the design process and understanding that buildings, like you said, can't be as rigid. They have to be able to be flexible and be able to adapt to different things in the future. Can you talk about the difference in process when designing a community space versus like a museum?
So I think in our dreams, the process is similar, but the results are different because the questions we're asking and the kind of issues we're addressing change. So we do a lot of work with Ralph Applebaum and Associates, who are museum exhibit designers in New York, and we've worked on different projects like in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the Obama Museum here in Chicago. We're doing a project in Alabama now. And even though those are more exhibit focused, so they're inside of a building or they're maybe at a bit of a smaller scale, not always at a smaller scale, but it's still about the experience, right? Like we want to design museum experiences that reflect the person standing outside the door, the person who lives down the street. We did a whole project with the Museum of Science and Industry that we called Beyond the Museum Walls, because the idea was like, we can't look at museums as institutions that are still high on a hill and are the giver of knowledge, but that it's actually a place to exchange. When you talk about museums and exhibits as a place of exchange, then you can imagine that's not totally dissimilar to like a community center or youth arts programming or even a coffee shop down the street. So I think if we have a process that can really understand why a project needs to exist, then we can design at whatever scale. We also do a lot of adaptive reuse because there's so much good building stock in cities like Chicago. So we often are carving space or creating program inside of something someone else has created, because frankly, it's one of the most sustainable ways to build.
When it comes to community centers and museums, both of these spaces are meant to bring people both from the neighborhood and from outside the neighborhood into the neighborhood to learn more about the topics. But when designing these spaces, how do you make it so that people want to interact with these spaces and make it so that it's engaging so that the people who are from that neighborhood also feel like it's theirs?
Well, I think that's a really good way of saying it, but it's like, it's really hard. Like if you're dealing with an existing museum or an existing institution that has a historic past, whether it's colonialism, whether it's, difficult to access because it's for others, right? That feeling of othering. But I think your engagement word makes a lot of sense. It's like we're building spaces for exchange. And if we think of how people want to like exchange knowledge, exchange information, exchange experiences, maybe that shifts the conversation a little bit. So it's not like, oh, you museum have this artifact that I want to come see. It might more be like when we did some early work on one of the projects, we were asking people about their story. So how does your story connect to the topic? So I might be going to look at an artifact, but I understand that artifact in the context of maybe my environment or the history I've experienced or a conflict that I'm aware of, right? So all of a sudden it's not like, oh, precious object, it has nothing to do with me. It starts to become, oh, precious object that ties into this story, and I'm part of that story or I'm part of that narrative. And then you can imagine like on spaces, like we just opened up a micro grocery, Southside Food Co-op, and we recently opened a coffee shop, and we're working on a community center. Like those are all spaces of exchange, and like, one's 1,400 square feet, one's 60,000 square feet, but we're using a lot of the same processes, right? We're having the same conversations. They want to be places for people to come together. So I think if we can think of it as exchange and coming together and being welcome, maybe these aren't so radically different in terms of how we're designing them.
I think that's important to really think about design, especially when it comes to social impact. Do you have any advice you would give to people who are interested in designing for social impact?
I think one of the things when people are talking about designing for social impact, I think there's always a question of like, do I have to do it on my own? Do I have to do it at a small organization? Can I do it in a big architecture firm? Like, I get this conversation a lot, often talking to students or young professionals. And I think that there's two ways to look at it. You can have social impact at any scale, right? Like it doesn't matter the size of the organization you're in, you have agency like as yourself to have an impact. And in some cases it might be having the dialogue in the firm or the office that you're in about like, why are we doing this? Or how do we affect a little more change? Or have we asked these questions? Or it might be like going out to a community organization and working directly. I think my one caution is always there needs to be a commitment to be there or a commitment to stay or a commitment to be honest about what resources you have available.
I think that's good advice. Thank you for that. As we wrap up the episode, first, I do want to thank you for being on this podcast. I like the conversation. I like the topics that we talked about. So we'll end it with our last question, talking about your future. So are there any goals or any aspirations you have for the future?
Oh, that's always a hard question. The future. So I think there's one thing. We have a really amazing team right now, and we're building a lot of strength in the team. And I think one big goal would be to be better at kind of empowering the whole team. Because some of our projects have just historically been long. So sometimes, I may be the only one who's touched it like 5 years ago or 7 years ago. But now we've started new projects where everyone in the office is part of the beginning of the project. So I'm hoping that more agency and more flexibility and more room to like do the social impact, be the change, is going to be really helpful. I'm really proud of the fact we've had some projects open recently, and we have people in the office that can like kind of see how people are responding or living in or working in these spaces that we've completed. And then there's this big always question for us about, you had talked about kind of the engagement and outreach and the architecture. And it's like, how do we do both? How do we continue to do both? And then how do we build the team that can like really make that happen?
We'll always be following you. I feel like, again, I really like the work that you guys do. I really like the process, honestly. I think that is the core of the projects that you guys do. So I'm looking forward to seeing the next few projects. I know everybody enjoyed this entire process of creating the podcast. So thank you for taking your time to be here.
Happy to. Thank you to all of you. I love what you guys do.
Right. Thank you. I want to thank everyone for listening. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform. You can follow us on Instagram at beyondthesurface_designpod or find us at beyondthesurfacepodcast.org. I want to thank our producer, Kayla Kwok, and the Beyond the Surface team for making this podcast possible. Thank you for listening to the episode of Beyond the Surface featuring Monica Chadha. Until next time, goodbye.